You're 7 years old, and your father can't look you in the eye. He keeps touching your hair, smoothing it down like he used to when you were small enough to ride on his shoulders. Your mother is weeping in the corner, her face turned toward the wall. Outside, a man with clean robes and cold eyes is waiting with a cart. You don't understand why they're dressing you in your best clothes. You don't understand why your brother gets to stay home. You reach for your mother's hand, but she pulls away, and in that moment of rejection, your childhood ends. The man with the cart has rope. He has coins. And he has a list of other names, other daughters, other families making the same terrible calculation on the same terrible day. Before we go any deeper, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. It's incredible how a story buried in ancient archives can somehow reach people across every continent today. This is China during the Song Dynasty, roughly 960 to 1279 CE, though the practices we're about to examine stretched across multiple dynasties for over 1,000 years. What you're about to hear isn't speculation or myth. It comes from imperial legal codes, administrative records meticulously kept by bureaucrats who saw nothing unusual in documenting the systematic destruction of human dignity, and eyewitness accounts preserved in private journals and court testimonies. These sources exist in shocking detail because the people creating them believed they were recording normal administrative procedure. They had no shame, they had no doubt, they had a civilization-wide consensus that what they were doing to women and girls was not just acceptable, but necessary. And that consensus, that normalization of horror, is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. The girl in the cart doesn't scream. By the time they reach the market in the city, she's learned that screaming brings the rope tighter around her wrists. She's learned that crying makes the buyers suspicious, makes them think she's defective, difficult. She's learned to make her face blank and her body still, because the other girls who fought are no longer in the cart. She doesn't know where they went. She's 7 years old, and she's already learning the mathematics of survival under conditions that should never require mathematics at all. The market opens twice weekly in major cities across China. The scale is staggering, not dozens of girls, but hundreds, lined up in rows according to age and perceived quality. The Song Dynasty records show that these markets were regulated, taxed, and treated as legitimate commercial enterprises. Imperial officials collected revenue on each transaction. Dealers specialized in different categories. Some focused on household servants, others on concubines, still others on workers for textile production. Each category had different pricing structures, different inspection protocols, different standards for what made a girl valuable or disposable. The inspection process was methodical. Buyers examined teeth for signs of disease or malnutrition. They felt muscles to assess capacity for physical labor. They checked skin for scars or blemishes that might indicate prior abuse or illness. They asked dealers about temperament, about whether the girl came from a stable family or a broken one. Girls from stable families commanded premium prices, based on the belief that children torn from loving homes would be more psychologically compliant, more broken by the separation, more desperate to please their new owners in hopes of somehow earning back what had been taken. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was calculated. Here's what makes the economics particularly devastating. Many families discovered that selling daughters could be profitable even when starvation wasn't imminent. The price for a healthy girl between 7 and 12 years old could fund a son's education, purchase better farming equipment, or buy enough land to significantly improve the family's social standing. This created a perverse market dynamic where daughters became investment opportunities rather than children. Families with multiple daughters would calculate the cost of raising each to marriageable age versus the immediate profit from selling her into slavery. The mathematics were often compelling, especially when Confucian values placed male lineage above all other considerations. But here's the question that sources almost never address directly. What happened to the parents afterward? Court records and personal journals offer glimpses. Some fathers became alcoholics, drowning in guilt they weren't permitted to acknowledge publicly. Some mothers died within years, their health collapsing under psychological burdens that had no sanctioned outlet. Yet Confucian scholars actively worked to reframe this trauma as virtue. They argued that sacrificing daughters for family survival demonstrated proper filial piety and moral character. Buddhist and Taoist teachers provided spiritual frameworks suggesting karmic necessity rather than economic brutality. The system didn't just destroy girls, it corrupted the possibility of authentic family love, forcing parents to perform emotional distance from daughters they might need to convert into currency. Tang Dynasty legal codes, which influenced subsequent dynasties for centuries, explicitly classified slaves and inferior people as legally equivalent to livestock. This wasn't metaphor or hyperbole. It was precise legal language with precise legal consequences. When a master killed a female slave, the maximum theoretical punishment was 1 year in prison. But even this minimal penalty was rarely enforced because slaves had no legal standing to file complaints, and no free person was legally obligated to report crimes against slaves. The law had created what modern legal scholars would recognize as a perfect environment for systematic abuse: complete power meeting, zero accountability. The inheritance laws revealed just how thoroughly women were objectified. When a master died, his female slaves were distributed among family members exactly like furniture or livestock. Wives could be separated from husbands, mothers from children. Existing relationships received no consideration because relationships between property items weren't legally cognizable. The law couldn't recognize what it had defined out of existence. Here's where the system becomes even more psychologically sophisticated. Female slaves who had sexual relationships with their masters, whether voluntary or forced, were sometimes reclassified as secondary wives rather than slaves. This might seem like an improvement, a promotion. It was actually a trap. As secondary wives, they lost any possibility of being sold to different households, meaning they became permanently bound to the very men who had been exploiting them. They couldn't flee to temples for sanctuary without bringing legal consequences down on any remaining family members. They couldn't be purchased by households where they might face better treatment. The system had weaponized status itself, turning what looked like elevation into a more permanent form of imprisonment. The judicial framework was deliberately constructed to make testimony from enslaved women legally inadmissible in court proceedings. This meant that even in the rare case where a female slave somehow gained access to legal proceedings, her account of abuse, torture, or sexual assault would be automatically excluded from consideration. The law protected perpetrators not through loopholes or ambiguities, but through explicit, clearly written rules that stated masters had usage rights over female slaves comparable to using horses for transportation or oxen for plowing. Ming Dynasty court records preserved because bureaucratic thoroughness was considered administrative virtue document cases where female slaves were tortured, mutilated, and killed for entertainment, with perpetrators facing no legal consequences whatsoever. These weren't scandals. They were routine filings, administrative notes, entries in ledgers. The horror lies not just in the acts themselves, but in how completely unremarkable they were considered to be. The sexual exploitation operated on multiple levels of calculated cruelty. Masters didn't just assault enslaved women for personal gratification. They constructed elaborate systems that turned human intimacy into weapons of psychological destruction. The practice of taking a female slave as a concubine created a particularly insidious trap. When a master elevated a slave to concubine status, he wasn't improving her condition, He was ensuring she could never escape. Secondary wives couldn't be sold. They couldn't flee. They couldn't even commit suicide without bringing shame and potential legal consequences down on family members who might still be living as free people. But the psychological manipulation went deeper. Masters deliberately created competition among enslaved women, forcing them to compete for sexual attention not because any of them desired it, but because the women who succeeded in pleasing their owner received marginally better treatment, an extra portion of food, a warmer blanket, fewer beatings. The system had weaponized survival instinct, turning victims against each other in struggles over whose degradation would be slightly less absolute. Archaeological evidence from excavated estates reveals how physical architecture was designed to facilitate systematic abuse. Separate quarters for female slaves were constructed without internal locks, without privacy barriers, and positioned close enough to main residences that screams wouldn't carry to neighboring properties. These weren't accidents of design. They were intentional features, built specifications that wealthy families included in construction contracts, the same way they might specify the number of windows or the quality of roofing materials. Perhaps most disturbing are the household management guides from the Song dynasty that include detailed instructions on how to sexually train young female slaves, with language and methodology borrowed directly from manuals on breaking horses or training hunting dogs. These texts were passed down through generations of elite families, creating institutional knowledge about human exploitation. They were copied, annotated, refined. Techniques that worked were documented. Methods that broke resistance most effectively were shared as best practices. Medical texts from the period describe specialized treatments for injuries commonly sustained by sexually abused slaves. The existence of this medical knowledge reveals something profound. Physicians weren't trying to prevent the abuse. They were simply maintaining the value of damaged property. Doctors developed expertise in treating specific types of trauma because the trauma was so widespread and systematic that it constituted a recognized medical specialty. The practice of foot binding added another dimension to this architecture of control. Young girls, sometimes as young as 3 years old, had their toes forcibly bent beneath their feet and bound with increasingly tight cloth strips. The bones would break and heal in unnatural positions over months and years, creating feet that were essentially stumps decorative, excruciating stumps that wealthy men found attractive. For enslaved women, foot binding served dual purposes. It marked them as sexual objects designed for male pleasure, and it made escape virtually impossible. Women with bound feet couldn't run. They could barely walk. When summoned for sexual use, they had to be carried to their master's chambers, completely helpless and physically dependent. The symbolism was intentional. Bound feet announced to everyone who saw them that the woman existed solely for male pleasure and had been permanently disabled to ensure her availability. The medical consequences were catastrophic: poor circulation, constant infections, rotting flesh, gangrenous toes. Many women lost entire sections of their feet to infection. The smell of decomposing tissue became so associated with enslaved women that it served as another marker of degraded status. Here's what reveals the depth of cultural corruption. Foot binding wasn't imposed by foreign conquerors or during brief periods of social chaos. It was developed and maintained by Chinese families who voluntarily mutilated their own daughters because the alternative was social and economic exclusion. The system had created conditions where natural female bodies were defined as defective, where systematic abuse was reframed as aesthetic improvement, where families would rather permanently disable their daughters than risk them being unmarriageable. When wealthy men died, their female slaves faced a choice that wasn't really a choice. They could volunteer to be buried alive with their master, ensuring their families received compensation and avoiding the brutal fate awaiting masterless slaves. Or they could survive as marked women, forever tainted by association with a dead owner, unemployable and unmarriageable in a society that viewed them as contaminated property. The preparation for these death rituals began the moment a master fell seriously ill. Female slaves would be gathered and informed of their options, though the presentation made clear only one choice was socially acceptable. Hoes who volunteered for burial were treated with sudden reverence, given better food and clothing, praised for loyalty and moral character. This temporary elevation served a crucial psychological purpose, convincing other slaves that death with honor was preferable to life with shame. The scale was staggering. When the Hongwu emperor died, over 40 concubines were forced to accompany him to the afterlife. The Yongle emperor's death resulted in more than 30 women being buried alive in his tomb. Historical records describe the process with bureaucratic precision, noting that some volunteers were rewarded with white silk scarves used for hanging, while others received poisoned final meals to ease their transition. The documentation exists not because anyone thought it was unusual, but because proper record-keeping was considered an administrative virtue. The most devastating aspect wasn't the killing itself, it was how the system corrupted the concept of choice. Women who had never even seen their master's face were expected to die for him, their lives considered so worthless that ending them required no justification beyond maintaining proper cosmic order. The practice created a culture where female suicide was celebrated as the highest form of virtue, turning self-destruction into moral obligation. The 7-year-old girl from the opening survived. Or rather, a record survives of a girl who matches her description, purchased by a household in Hangzhou, assigned to textile work until she reached an age the documents describe as suitable for other purposes. The record notes her sale to a different household at age 14, then her reclassification as a concubine at 16. After that, the documents go silent. Her name appears in one more ledger, an inventory compiled when her owner died, and his property was distributed among heirs. She's listed between a writing desk and a collection of ceramic vases. She was 19. The archives are full of girls like her. Not because their stories were considered important, but because bureaucratic thoroughness demanded that every transaction be recorded, every piece of property accounted for, every exchange of ownership properly documented. They were writing history without realizing it. They preserved evidence of systematic horror because they saw nothing horrible in what they were preserving. What survives in those archives isn't just data about prices and legal codes and numbers of victims. What survives is the shape of a civilization's moral structure, the outline of how an entire society convinced itself that certain human beings weren't quite human enough to deserve protection, dignity, or mercy. The mechanisms they developed, the legal frameworks, the economic incentives, the cultural justifications, the architectural designs, the medical specializations, the religious rationalizations, all of it reveals how thoroughly evil can be systematized when enough people agree to look away. The girl in the cart learned to make her face blank. She learned the mathematics of survival. She learned that screaming makes you disposable. And somewhere in the bureaucratic precision of imperial archives, her daughter learned the same lessons, and her daughter's daughter after that, through centuries of systematic dehumanization that was never a secret, never hidden, never considered shameful enough to hide. The records are still there, preserved in meticulous detail by people who thought they were simply doing their jobs.